The look through this prism may just be addicting. A recent article looked at the substances within the stuff of Oreo cookies and discovered that it may trigger more pleasure centers in the brain than cocaine. This brings to mind how foods are made, especially processed and fast foods, and what impact it has both on the brain and the body. To look into food, addiction, and how it impacts us both neurologically and physiologically, we're being joined by Dr. Beatrice Golomb. She is a professor of medicine at the University of California at San Diego. Welcome back, Dr. Golomb.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Let's talk about these fake foods or fake additives and go away from sort of the natural ones that trigger hunger. What are some of these substances and where would we find them?
Well, one example are something that most people have heard of, which are transfats or hydrogenated fats. And those are found in a lot of purchased baked goods and a lot of fast foods. And now there's sort of misleading labeling that allows people to say 0 grams trans fats if there's less than 0.5 grams per serving, leaving what constitutes a serving to the discretion of the manufacturer. So what a lot of companies did is they simply reduced what they called a serving size so that they could label the product 0 grams trans fats. And trans fats are a substance that, like many fake foods, trigger what's called oxidative stress, which you will sort of know through having heard of what are called antioxidants. And everybody knows that antioxidants are good, but what they're good at doing is protecting against a certain type of cell injury from something called oxidative stress. So trans fats trigger oxidative stress and inflammation, and one of the things that oxidative stress does is it impairs cells' ability to produce energy. And when cells are not making energy enough, they tell you should be hungry. And they also send signals that lead to increased deposition of calories as fats. And this is why I term a lot of these fake foods anti-foods. The purpose of food is to feed substances to the body that the cells require to be healthy, and anti-foods often provide substances that are actually damaging to the cells. Another one of these food categories are high fructose corn syrup, and one factor in high fructose corn syrup is mercury contamination, which occurs, according to some articles, in the processing and the manufacturing of high fructose corn syrup. And mercury is a heavy metal, and heavy metals are potent oxidative stressors. And another factor that people are often unfamiliar with is arsenic that occurs commonly in chicken. Arsenic actually makes animals, it sort of poisons the metabolism in a way that makes animals fatter and grow faster. In the old days, it was used in a substance called apatone that was used to make horses gain weight, and it's used in the U.S. legally. As I understand, it's actually illegal in Europe, but routine in the United States to include arsenic products in chicken feed in order to make them gain weight faster. Now, of course, this poisons the chicken's metabolism, and then it gets into you and poisons your metabolism. And there's the added further problem that now, because chicken poop can be used as a fertilizer, including in organic products, even if the chickens weren't fed organically, there's increasing reports of arsenic contamination, even in things like organic rice crops. So arsenic is another sort of anti-food related element that has been linked to adverse, quote, metabolic consequences like hypertension, typically higher blood pressure, higher blood sugar, and weight gain, as well as worse cholesterol profiles are linked together in something called metabolic syndrome. And typically when one of those is adversely affected, if you look carefully, they all are, although not necessarily all to exactly the same degree. So those are some of the examples of what I would term anti-foods that actually can be damaging to cells in a fashion that may promote fat deposition and also hunger.
So let's take some of those in a little bit more depth if it's possible. You said that the food makers chose a rather clever strategy when pressure was coming from the public to reduce the amount of this processed fat. They didn't change the recipe, they changed the quantity side. So if I'm a consumer, how do I know that these trans fats are in the product that I might be eating?
Right. So what you need to do is actually go to the ingredient list per se, and if you see the word hydrogenated or partially hydrogenated, then go to a different food source.
in terms of arsenic, I remember hearing relatively recently there was a hue about arsenic being part of apple juice because arsenic is also a natural part of the seed of the apple. But you're telling me it's also something which is being artificially added to a poultry diet in order to enlarge the chickens, and then it may actually be getting into the diet of organically grown chickens through other methods?
The issue isn't specifically organically grown chickens, it's organically grown produce because chicken manure is used as an allowable fertilizer for organic products, and there isn't a requirement that the chickens themselves were grown without use of arsenic for that manure to be an allowable fertilizer. So the arsenic then goes into the chicken manure, which goes into the soil, which is taken up into the organic produce.
And arsenic at a certain level is fine for the human body, but once it passes a certain threshold, it does become damaging. Is there a way to determine when you've reached a point where you may be getting damaged or you may need to seek treatment for arsenic poisoning?
Well, there are tests for heavy metal levels, but I would actually argue that there isn't any amount that is safe to intentionally include in food products, because arsenic at any level is an oxidative stressor and is added to your other load of oxidative stressors. And in an individual, that other load may already be high enough that adding any amount may be injurious. So I would suggest that that we should perhaps adopt the European approach, which is that arsenic should not be allowable to be as a factor incorporated into animal feed.
Now, mercury was the last one you mentioned, and I've heard very similar things about mercury, which is that it's almost impossible to determine what amount or when that mercury is going to trigger a rather significant effect in a human being, which could have strong neurological impacts or other. So what do we do about mercury? Is it we need to avoid certain types of fish, or how do we handle the mercury problem?
Right. That's a really interesting and difficult question. You just mentioned the issue of fish, which we hadn't really been talking about, but you're right. Mercury contamination is an increasing problem in fish. I saw an article a few weeks ago that now all of California's rivers are considered to be contaminated, including with mercury. And of course, this is probably not assisted by the process of using these new light bulbs that have mercury, so that if you break a light bulb, mercury is released into the environment and can get potentially into the soil and the waterways and so forth. You're right, oceans increasingly experience mercury contamination, and foods that are higher up the food chain accumulate more mercury by eating fish that are lower on the food chain that have accumulated a smaller degree of mercury. So really, one approach is to relatively avoid the types of fish that are higher on the food chain, and also to try to seek fish products from cleaner waters. And this is really, a thorny issue, because the long chain omega-3 fatty acids that we primarily get from fish actually are very important for neurological health, and yet the mercury and other contaminants that now increasingly accompany those fish are adverse for neurological health and also for cardiac health. In the older studies, there was a trial called the diet and reinfarction trial that I believe it was in the 1980s, took men who had had a previous heart attack and assigned them to any one of several different diets. And the cholesterol-lowering diet didn't benefit mortality, and the high-fiber diet didn't benefit mortality, but a diet that simply advised people to eat 2 fish meals a week led to a 30% reduction in all-cause mortality over 2 years, which is an enormous reduction in mortality, so an enormous benefit. But more recent trials using fish and fish oil have had more mixed findings, and this may very well be in part because there are studies showing that people who eat more fish, if it's from high mercury areas, including an area of Finland, actually people who eat more fish in mercury-contaminated areas actually have higher rates of heart attack. So it's becoming an increasingly problematic issue, since our bodies really need these long-chain omega-3 fatty acids that, by the way, our bodies produce a little bit of from short-chain omega-3 fatty acids from plant material, but the process of production of those long-chain omega-3 fatty acids is, A, very inefficient, So it really is better to get it from the sort of fish and so forth. And B, that process is actually inhibited by eating trans fats, which we already talked about. So trans fats have this additional mechanism for adversely affecting neurological health. So the short answer is aim for fish that are lower on the food chain.
Sometimes when we deal with the issue of foodborne illness, which is not necessarily what we're talking about here, the answer I've been told is cook things at reasonably high temperatures and cook them well.
Right. And that works if the foodborne illness is caused by a live organism like, a bacterium particularly.
And that's where I was going. So this will not help in terms of either arsenic or mercury, right?
That's correct.
So we used to rely on a program of common sense and due diligence. But is consumer beware even possible these days?
It certainly is complicated, and probably it has always been complicated. But I do think we all as citizens need to push for, as much as possible, full disclosure by manufacturers. This idea that people should not have to disclose, for example, use of genetically modified products is ridiculous. For one thing, the primary genetic modifications are herbicide resistance, which means they're pouring more poison on the plant in order to reduce labor costs. And those poisons, those herbicides, are also oxidative stressors, or insertion of an insecticidal lignan, which is also a toxin, perhaps preferentially for insects, but essentially the substances that we use for their toxicity for insects also are not good for human cells either. So this idea that people should be exempted from reporting some of their processes is one that I completely disagree with. And then the other point that you make is, yes, it's extremely difficult to ensure that your food supply is comparatively pure. There are steps that you can take to relatively protect, and one is to read labels carefully for the things they are required to disclose and aim for sort of whole food products that are as close to the plant or animal as possible, and that don't include sort of chemical-sounding ingredients.
If you don't want to go here, just let me know. We'll skip this question. But it was one of the things which actually drove me to this topic. When I read the article about the Oreo and the stuff activating the pleasure centers in the brain, one of my first thoughts was actually about big tobacco and how big tobacco used to, and possibly still, add addictive ingredients on purpose in order to get people to want to purchase and use their product more. And I'm wondering, when we talk about these anti-foods, as you call them, when we talk about these substances that we're adding to our foods that make us hungry, is there an intentionality to it? Do you think that there is purpose behind it because this will help line pockets better?
Right. And let me just preface this by saying I'm not an expert in this area. I believe there actually already is a literature out there that I have seen glimpses of that actually suggests that, if you were the head of a multi-billion-dollar industry and had a perceived obligation to your stockholders, these are often publicly traded companies, then you need to maximize profits. And one major mechanism for maximizing products is to maximize sales, and one mechanism for maximizing sales with food-based products is to increase people's desire to come back for more. And so, a lot of these major companies certainly have research arms that have the intention of identifying how they can modify their products in a fashion to maximize sales. And as I say, I think there is a literature on that. I think there are, I've even sort of seen an allusion to issues that discuss something that may be called the sweet spot, or something that refers to sort of the ratios of fat to sugar to salt that optimize ingestion. And certainly I believe that there's literature, but I'm not the right person to talk to because I'm not an expert in this area, on approaches that are used to identify other sort of substances to include that enhance people's desire to consume more of the product. Now, as I say, that may already happen kind of naturally simply by including these anti-foods, because by poisoning cell energy production, that may lead to enhancement of hunger signals, which may lead to more consumption of products.
And probably the final question, and it's a bit of a guilty one. as someone with a sweet tooth, someone who does like dessert, but who tries to exercise 4 or 5 times a week, is there still a balance? Can I afford to get my piece of cheesecake or eat my dark chocolate?
I don't actually consider that sweets are inherently anti-foods. There's a reason that evolution mandated that we like sweet things. Now, of course, I think a big part of that reason is that fruits are particularly rich in antioxidants and are also sweet. But there are, quote, sweet foods that are not inherently bad. I think chocolate itself certainly has multiple favorable health properties. People who eat chocolate more often in longitudinal observational studies live longer. They have lower rate of development of dementing illness. They have lower rates of heart attack. Chocolate has been shown to be associated with lower rates of heart failure. It's associated with increased mental processing speed in a study that we did in young adults and improved executive function in older adults. And there are some randomized controlled trials that show the same thing. There are recent studies in rats that show that rats that are fed epicatechin derived from cocoa, which is one of the polyphenol, favorable substances in chocolate, actually increase their production of the energy-producing elements in cells called mitochondria, and increase production of blood vessels that allow more oxygen and energy to get to cells. And feeding those rats that substance allows them to perform better in endurance tests as though they had been endurance trained. Our own data suggests that people who eat chocolate more often, consistent with favorable metabolic effects from antioxidants, actually, even though they didn't eat fewer calories and didn't exercise more, actually weighed less, which actually seems to be aligned with the findings in these rats, which also didn't eat fewer calories, but also seem to have lower fat mass. So chocolate, which is typically eaten in sweet form, despite the fact that it's eaten in that sweet form, has these numerous favorable associations. There are many other sweet products that in which the sugar accompanies other real foods. Dairy products are actually, particularly in older studies before dairy was as contaminated with things and when it was still more often whole milk, dairy is associated with lower rather than higher cardiovascular risk and particularly lower stroke risk. So that, you mentioned cheesecake. Dairy is not inherently a bad food. Certainly fruit desserts come with fruit, which is not inherently bad. I will say that if you're going to have sweets, it may actually be better to have high fat using, good quality fats, because fat blunts the rise in blood sugar that would occur with the sugar, which blunts the release of insulin, which blunts the drop in blood sugar, which then is what triggers the body to become insulin resistant or, drive you toward things like diabetes. So there may actually be advantages if you're having a sweet that comes with good quality, that is to say real food fats, and perhaps also that comes with protein. For example, in brownies you may have eggs, and eggs lead to release of glucagon, which offsets the effects of insulin, which is what's triggered with sort of high sugar. So all of this is a sort of convoluted way of saying that sweets don't have to be bad, and a few generations ago people still enjoyed sweets, and there wasn't the epidemic of obesity that we see today. Certainly there's a lot more access to fast foods, but I think far more of the problem are actually oxidative stressors, fake foods, etc., although simply, calorie intake versus calorie expenditure is a big part of the issue as well.
Looking through the prism at foods as well as anti-foods, I'm Andrew Hiller for The Voice of Russia, and I've been joined by Dr. Beatrice Golomb. She's a professor of medicine at UC San Diego. Thank you so much for the insight and the warnings.
Okay, well, thank you very much.